All right, let's get into Chapter 5G, the Global Banking Cabal. Quote, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is eager to enter into close relationship with the Bank for International Settlements. The conclusion is impossible to escape that the State and Treasury Departments are willing to pool the banking system of Europe and America, setting up a world financial power independent of and above the government of the United States. The United States, under present conditions, will be transformed from the most active of manufacturing nations into a consuming and importing nation with a balance of trade against it, unquote. Representative Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, quoted in the New York Times, June 1930. At the end of 2012, our national trade deficit stood at $540 billion. Now, I'm going to discuss the central banks for the entire world that the proponents of the New World Order have set up, that the individual nations' central banks, like the Federal Reserve, will ultimately answer to. Their conspiracy is a global one, and in order to control the entire globe, it necessitates controlling all of the world's money through one entity. They do not have a single entity as of yet. They have three entities: the Bank for International Settlement, BIS, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These three will probably be merged into one giant global bank after the United States dollar spins into hyperinflation and the big banking crash occurs, which as of early 2013 is not very far off. Let's begin by talking about the first one of these to come into existence, the BIS. Now keep in mind that I could go on for dozens of pages describing each one of these privately held agencies. So for the sake of keeping this book to a readable length, I will just give you an overview of the facts. To start with, the BIS is housed in a building that was intentionally meant to look like the most famous artist's rendition of the Tower of Babel. This was not a coincidence by a long shot, as the people running the show are again paying homage to Nimrod. The BIS meets once a month in Switzerland, home of the untouchable Swiss bank accounts you probably have heard of, where the elite hide a lot of their electronic wealth. Each of the dozen or so visiting members from the largest central banks around the world has his own office at the BIS with secure telephone lines to his home country. The membership of this private club is restricted to a handful of powerful men who determine daily the interest rate, the availability of credit, and the money supply of the banks in their own countries. They include the governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the Swiss National Bank, and the German Bundesbank, among others. The Bank of International Settlements was originally established in May 1930 by bankers and diplomats of Europe and the United States to collect and disperse Germany's World War I reparation payments. Although the BIS was organized as a commercial bank with publicly held shares, its immunity from government interference and taxes in both peace and war was guaranteed by an international treaty signed in The Hague in 1930. Since the BIS also provided a safe and convenient repository for the gold holdings of the European central banks, it quickly evolved into the Bank for Central Banks. As the world depression deepened in the 30s and financial panics flared up in Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Germany, the governors in charge of the key central banks feared that the entire global financial system would collapse unless they could closely coordinate their rescue efforts. The obvious meeting spot for this collective effort was the BIS, where they regularly met anyway to facilitate gold swaps and war-damaged settlements. After World War II, the BIS reemerged as the main clearinghouse for European currencies and, behind the scenes, the favored meeting place of central bankers. When the United States dollar came under attack in the 1960s, Massive swaps of money and gold were arranged at the BIS for the defense of the American currency. The BIS is the main worldwide money organizing group of the three, and is by far the most secretive and powerful. The latter two entities, the IMF and World Bank, are more of a public face for the global banking scheme, and came about through the Bretton Woods system in July of 1944. The Bretton Woods system refers to the international monetary regime that dominated global finance from the end of World War II until the early 1970s. Taking its name from the site of the 1944 conference, the Bretton Woods system set up a system of rules, institutions, and procedures to regulate the global monetary system. The planners at Bretton Woods established the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which today is known simply as the World Bank. The IMF and the World Bank were designed to work together, with the IMF acting as the judicial executive branch, mediating between the member countries and running the show, while the World Bank was to be exactly what it was called, the bank for the entire world, providing endless fiat money to war-ravaged and underdeveloped nations for economic development, all for a price, of course. The World Bank has taken in as collateral for these loans entire countries' supplies of natural resources in the process. Through the use of the Illuminati-controlled CIA, puppet governments were set up all over the third world nations of the world in order to control the governments receiving those loans, in order to ensure they defaulted on them. This pushed the countries far further in the hole and in debt to the proponents of the New World Order. One of the main reasons for Bretton Woods was to establish global exchange rates tied into a physical commodity, gold, in order to establish some sense of stability in the world markets after the Illuminati-induced chaos of the Great Depression and World War II. To set up this stability, they tied only the US dollar to the value of gold, and all the other world currencies would be in turn tied to the dollar. In order to facilitate the New World Order, they needed to get trade moving freely, very freely, in order to bring down the big industrialized nations by transferring jobs out of the high-paying Western nations and into the slave-wage third world nations. This would have a twofold effect for them. It would destroy the powerful Western country middle class, who would be their biggest threat to world domination, and it would topple the Western power structure, sending the world into a power vacuum that a global government, the New World Order, would fill just nicely. In order to help this along, organizations such as the World Trade Organization, the G20, and trade agreements such as NAFTA and GATT were implemented, and have done a pretty good job of their primary goal of transferring manufacturing from the United States to third world sweatshops and knocking the USA off the high and mighty manufacturing perch we once stood upon. By the early 1970s, the Illuminati were ready to light the fuse on their new worldwide fiat money pyramid scheme, and on August 15, 1971, the United States pulled out of the Bretton Woods Accord, taking the U.S. off the gold exchange standard. The 25% gold reserve requirement for Federal Reserve notes was ended in 1971 when President Nixon totally removed the dollar from any gold basis. Since 1971, the value of the dollar has been strictly based on supply and demand of the dollars themselves. This allowed the dollar to float. Shortly thereafter, Britain followed, floating the pound sterling. The industrialized nations followed suit with their respective currencies. In anticipation of the fluctuation of currencies as they stabilized against each other, the industrialized nations also increased their reserves by printing money, or inflating, in amounts far greater than ever before. The result was a depreciation of the value of the US dollar like never before, as well as the other currencies of the world. This is why there was massive inflation in the 1970s, culminating with the Federal Reserve having to ratchet up interest rates to around 20% circa 1980 to 81 in order to put the brakes on the runaway inflation freight train. They came close at that time to crashing the dollar, but the Illuminati weren't quite ready to implode the economies of the world just yet. Unfortunately for the people alive right now in 2013, they are now ready to let the pyramid collapse, and you're going to see quite the financial disasters in the coming months and years. They needed a scheme of such massive fraud that the world would not be able to dig themselves out of the black hole, and would have to capitulate to a single world currency under control of the proponents of the Great Plan. This scheme was hatched during the Clinton administration, when Clinton, an alleged 33rd degree Freemason and bona fide Illuminati henchman, repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, also known as the Banking Act of 1933. In the wake of the wild speculation that helped fuel the fire that caused the stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression, patriotic congressmen took it upon themselves to regulate the banks that had contributed the gasoline to turn the small fire into a raging inferno that engulfed the entire world. The Glass-Steagall Act was put in place in response to the climate of corruption, financial manipulation, and insider trading which led to more than 5,000 bank failures in the years following the 1929 Wall Street crash. It also prohibited commercial banks, brokerage firms, hedge funds, institutional investors, pension funds, and insurance companies from investing or speculating in each other's businesses. It also established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC for short. After Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall in 1999, the Illuminati's wolves on Wall Street headed straight for the henhouse that was the American middle class by creating something called derivatives. The term derivative means just that. Its value is derived from something else, usually another derivative in the way they use them. Derivatives are paper-based investments, based on paper-based investments, based on paper-based investments, right on down the line, until you finally run into the tangible thing that thousands and millions of these mini pyramid schemes were based on. The black hole that was created by these derivatives still exists. The gaping debt hole that has only been temporarily plugged as of the writing of this book. I've run into estimates that the black hole may be up to $1.5 quadrillion debt abyss that is literally going to suck the entire global economy into it, and this event will cause such an upheaval that civilization as we know it will probably end, and the Luciferian one world government will rise out of its ashes. It actually came out in the mainstream media during the financial crisis of 2008 that Bank of America alone was sitting on $50 trillion worth of derivatives exposure. This is just one of many huge international banks playing with fire via derivatives. Only 20 of these banks with the same exposure as Bank of America adds up to $1 quadrillion, and there are way more than 20 international banks involved. So we're talking about an absolutely huge sum of financial liability. A literal black hole of electronic money debt just waiting to swallow up the present-day economic systems of the world. Mark my words, this is going to happen in the very near future, and it will be ugly. I will go over how to prepare for this as best as possible at the end of this book. Okay, well that's the end of that subchapter, and I think Jeff's doing a really good job, or did a really good job of tying this stuff in with the plan. I mean, it's one thing to blame these setups of our economy, the derivatives, on greed, and greed is a factor, but it's a huge factor because the bait is money. Money is God. And okay, that's it for that one. Talk to you later.